You feel like you're constantly reacting to problems instead of preventing them, always one step behind, while others seem to anticipate challenges before they arise. You're tired of being caught off guard by situations that derail your progress, watching as people with seemingly less talent navigate obstacles with ease while you struggle through each crisis. I am Sun Tzu, and I proved that the supreme excellence is to subdue the enemy without fighting, through superior strategic thinking that sees beyond the immediate battle. The strategic principles I'll share will give you the mental framework to think 10 moves ahead, transforming you from someone who reacts to circumstances into someone who shapes them. Whether you're fighting for territory or fighting for your future, the same strategic mind that conquered ancient battlefields can conquer any challenge you face in the modern world. Start by liking this video, subscribing for more proven strategies, and telling me in the comments where you're watching from. I'm curious to see our global community of strategic thinkers grow. The bronze gong that once called my armies to attention now sits silent before me, but I remember the weight of that first broken shield, shattered not by enemy strength, but by my own failure to think beyond the immediate moment. Let me tell you about the burden I carried in my early days as a military leader, when I lived in the exhausting cycle of constant reaction. I was like most commanders of my time, believing that quick reflexes and fierce determination were enough to secure victory. Each morning brought new crises demanding immediate attention. Enemy movements required instant response. Supply shortages needed urgent solutions. Troop morale issues demanded immediate action. I spent my days running from one fire to the next, never able to catch my breath, never able to see beyond the crisis of the moment. The psychological toll was immense. When you live in reactive mode, your mind becomes a slave to circumstances. You wake each day wondering what disaster awaits, what unexpected challenge will derail your carefully laid plans. Your energy depletes not from solving problems, but from the constant state of emergency response. You begin to believe that chaos is normal, that being overwhelmed is simply the price of leadership. I watched my soldiers mirror this reactive mindset. They became excellent at responding to immediate threats, but terrible at preventing them. They could fight bravely when cornered, but couldn't recognize when they were being led into traps. Most devastating of all, they began to expect defeat, preparing for failure rather than positioning for victory. The breaking point came during a campaign where my reactive thinking led to 3 consecutive tactical defeats. Each loss wasn't due to inferior numbers or equipment. It was because I was always responding to my enemy's moves instead of forcing them to respond to mine. I was playing their game on their terms, and predictably, I was losing. That broken shield represents more than military failure. It symbolizes the cost of living defensively. When your mind operates in reactive mode, you're always defending territory rather than claiming new ground. You're always responding to other people's initiatives rather than setting the agenda yourself. You're always fighting the battles they choose at the times they select on the terrain they prefer. I realized that most people remain trapped in this reactive pattern because it feels productive. There's an addictive quality to crisis management. The adrenaline rush of urgent problem solving, the temporary satisfaction of putting out fires, the false sense of importance that comes from being constantly needed to handle emergencies. But this reactive productivity is an illusion that keeps you busy while ensuring you never make real progress. The moment I understood this truth was the moment my military philosophy began to transform. I stopped asking, how do I respond to this threat? And started asking, how do I position myself so this threat becomes irrelevant? That shift in thinking from reactive response to strategic positioning became the foundation of everything I would later teach about the art of war and the strategic mind. The first strategic map I ever drew still bears the ink stains of that pivotal moment when everything changed. It was crude compared to the detailed terrain analyses I would later create, but it represented something revolutionary. The first time I learned to see beyond immediate circumstances to the underlying patterns that determine victory. The breakthrough came during what should have been another routine campaign. My forces were positioned in a valley facing an enemy army twice our size positioned on the high ground. Every tactical manual suggested we should retreat immediately or attempt a desperate frontal assault. But as I studied that terrain for the third sleepless night, something shifted in my perception. I began to see the battlefield not as a static obstacle, but as a dynamic system of interconnected elements. The river that seemed to favor my enemy's position could become their weakness if I understood water patterns. The high ground they occupied required longer supply lines. The season was shifting toward winter, which would affect their resources differently than mine. Most importantly, I realized their position, while tactically superior, was strategically vulnerable. Instead of asking, "How do I defeat this army?" I started asking, "What conditions would make this army defeat itself?" This question opened entirely new possibilities. I mapped not just the physical terrain, but the psychological terrain, their commander's personality, their troops' morale patterns, their supply dependencies, their political pressures from home. My transformation from tactical reaction to strategic thinking revealed that every situation contains multiple layers of reality. The surface layer shows immediate circumstances, what everyone can see and react to. The deeper layers reveal the forces that create those circumstances, the patterns, dependencies, and motivations that most people never examine. When I finally acted, it wasn't with the desperate energy of reaction, but with the calm confidence of strategic positioning. I didn't attack their strength. I repositioned to make their strength irrelevant. Instead of fighting for the valley, I made the valley less valuable than the position I created for them to chase. Instead of trying to overcome their advantages, I created new advantages they couldn't match. The victory that followed required minimal, actual fighting. By the time the decisive moment arrived, their tactical superiority had become strategic liability. They won every engagement, but lost the campaign because I had shifted the game to one where their tactical skills became irrelevant. This experience taught me that the mind shapes reality before action begins. Your strategic thinking determines which battle you fight, on what terms, at what time, with what resources. Most people lose battles in their minds long before they lose them in reality, because they accept the framing their circumstances appear to dictate. That hand-drawn map marked the birth of my philosophy: know yourself, know your enemy, and victory is assured. But more fundamentally, it represented my understanding that strategic thinking is about seeing systems where others see situations, recognizing patterns where others see chaos, and creating leverage where others see obstacles. The EO strategic mind doesn't just react to reality, it participates in creating the reality to which others must react. The 5-element compass I carried into every campaign became my most trusted strategic tool, its directional points representing the fundamental forces that determine victory in any endeavor. After years of studying successful and failed campaigns, I discovered that every strategic situation can be understood through 5 essential elements that work together like the forces of nature itself. The first element is the way, what I call Tao. This represents the alignment between your purpose and the natural principles that govern success. When I led armies, I learned that soldiers fight hardest when they believe their cause serves something greater than personal gain. The way is about moral authority, shared values, and the spiritual momentum that comes from righteous purpose. In modern terms, this is your mission alignment, ensuring that your strategic goals resonate with deeper principles of growth, contribution, and authentic value creation. I discovered that armies with strong Tao could overcome superior numbers because their soldiers fought with the strength of conviction. They didn't just follow orders, they embodied the mission. This same principle applies to personal strategy. When your goals align with your deepest values and serve purposes larger than self-interest, you access reserves of energy and persistence that surprise even yourself. The second element is heaven, the dimension of timing and environmental factors beyond your direct control. Heaven encompasses seasons, weather patterns, and the natural rhythms that influence all strategic action. I learned to read these patterns like a farmer reads soil conditions, understanding when circumstances favor advance and when they counsel patience. Heaven teaches that strategic success requires harmony with natural timing rather than forcing action against environmental resistance. Some battles can only be won in winter. Others require spring energy. Some strategic moves succeed during economic expansion. Others work best during contraction. The wise strategist studies these cycles and positions actions to flow with favorable conditions rather than fighting against them. The third element is earth, the terrain of your circumstances, both physical and metaphorical. Earth represents resources, geographical advantages, market conditions, and the structural realities within which you must operate. I spent countless hours studying terrain because I understood that superior positioning on favorable ground could compensate for inferior numbers. Earth in modern strategy means understanding your competitive landscape, resource availability, market dynamics, and the structural advantages you can claim or create. The key insight is that terrain itself can be shaped through strategic action. You're not merely adapting to circumstances, but actively creating more favorable conditions. The fourth element is command, the quality of strategic leadership and decision-making. This encompasses wisdom, trustworthiness, benevolence, courage, and strictness. Command is about earning the voluntary cooperation of others and, most importantly, exercising effective leadership over yourself. I learned that external victories are impossible without first achieving internal command. The fifth element is methods, the systems, processes, and disciplines that ensure consistent strategic execution. Methods include organization, resource allocation, communication systems, and the tactical procedures that translate strategic thinking into reliable results. These 5 elements work in harmony like the forces that govern nature itself. Weakness in any element undermines the whole system, while strength in all 5 creates strategic power that appears effortless to outside observers, but represents sophisticated understanding of how victory actually works. The polished bronze mirror that accompanied me through every campaign served a purpose far more important than vanity. It was my daily reminder that the most crucial battlefield exists within ourselves. Each morning, I would study not just my physical reflection, but examine the inner terrain where victories and defeats are truly decided. Self-knowledge became my strategic foundation after a humbling defeat that taught me the devastating cost of self-deception. I had convinced myself that my aggressive temperament was pure strength, never recognizing how it made me predictable to patient enemies. I believed my quick decision-making was always an advantage, failing to see how it sometimes prevented deeper strategic thinking. Most dangerous of all, I had accepted others' assessments of my capabilities without conducting my own honest inventory. The inner battlefield has 4 dimensions that every strategic mind must map with ruthless accuracy. The first dimension is your true strengths versus your perceived strengths. I discovered that what I thought were my greatest assets were sometimes elaborate compensations for weaknesses I refused to acknowledge. My reputation for bold action, for instance, sometimes masked an impatience that prevented me from gathering sufficient intelligence before acting. True strength emerges from honest assessment. I learned to distinguish between skills that came naturally and skills I had developed through necessity. Natural talents could be leveraged and amplified, while developed skills required ongoing maintenance and had predictable failure patterns under stress. Understanding this difference allowed me to position myself in situations that maximized my authentic capabilities, while minimizing exposure of my vulnerabilities. The second dimension involves mapping your emotional patterns and decision-making tendencies. I began tracking how different types of pressure affected my judgment, how fatigue influenced my risk tolerance, and how success or failure in one area colored my perception of unrelated situations. This emotional cartography revealed that my mind operated with consistent patterns that could be strategically managed. For example, I discovered that my confidence peaked dangerously after minor victories, leading to overextension, while setbacks made me overly conservative, causing me to miss opportunities that required bold action. Once I recognized these patterns, I could compensate for them, making more calibrated decisions regardless of my emotional state. The third dimension is your cognitive blind spots, the systematic ways your mind distorts reality to protect your self-image or maintain comfortable beliefs. I found that I consistently underestimated opponents who used methods different from mine and overestimated the importance of factors where I had advantages. These blind spots created predictable vulnerabilities that skilled enemies could exploit. The fourth dimension encompasses your deepest motivations, fears, and values, the psychological forces that ultimately drive your strategic choices. I learned that self-knowledge without self-acceptance leads to internal conflict that undermines external effectiveness. The goal isn't to eliminate weaknesses, but to understand them so completely that they become manageable variables in your strategic planning. This practice of honest self-assessment requires courage because it demands abandoning comfortable illusions about yourself. But I discovered that leaders who truly know themselves become nearly impossible to manipulate or surprise because they understand their own reactions better than their enemies do. My collection of terrain scrolls represents thousands of hours spent studying landscapes, not just for their obvious features, but for their hidden strategic possibilities. I learned that the ability to read environmental conditions with precision often matters more than the strength of your forces or the boldness of your plans. Every situation presents three types of terrain: favorable, hostile, and neutral. Favorable terrain amplifies your natural advantages and supports your strategic objectives. Hostile terrain works against your strengths and requires either avoidance or transformation. Neutral terrain can be shaped to become favorable through strategic action and proper positioning. I remember a campaign where my initial assessment labeled certain mountainous terrain as hostile to my cavalry-based forces. However, deeper study revealed that while the terrain hindered my preferred tactics, it also created opportunities for different approaches that my enemies weren't prepared to counter. What appeared to be a disadvantage became the foundation for unexpected strategic advantage. The art of environmental assessment requires looking beyond surface conditions to understand underlying dynamics. When I studied a battlefield, I examined not just the current layout, but how that layout would change under different weather conditions, how it would affect supply lines over extended periods, and how seasonal variations might alter its strategic value. In one famous engagement, I identified terrain that appeared neutral to most observers, but contained hidden advantages that only became apparent during specific weather conditions. By positioning my forces to take advantage of these hidden features, I was able to achieve victory against superior numbers when the environmental conditions aligned with my strategic plan. The key insight is that most people fight their environment. Instead of using it, they see obstacles where strategic minds see tools. They view limitations as permanent features rather than temporary conditions that can be transformed through patient, strategic work. Modern environmental assessment means understanding the competitive landscape, market dynamics, organizational, culture, and resource flows within which you must operate. Just as I studied river patterns to predict seasonal flooding, today's strategic thinkers must study economic cycles, technological trends, and social shifts to position themselves advantageously. Developed a systematic approach to reading circumstances. First, map the obvious features that everyone can see. Second, identify the hidden patterns and dependencies that most people miss. Third, project how current conditions will evolve over time. Fourth, determine which elements can be influenced and which must be accepted. Finally, position yourself to benefit from favorable changes while protecting against hostile developments. The most profound realization from my terrain studies was that environments themselves can be strategically modified. Rivers can be diverted, valleys can be flooded, and mountain passes can be controlled. Similarly, market conditions can be influenced, organizational cultures can be shaped, and competitive landscapes can be altered through sustained strategic action. The strategic mind doesn't merely adapt to environmental conditions, it participates in creating more favorable conditions while preparing to thrive, regardless of which environmental scenario actually develops. The golden chess piece I carved during a long winter siege represents the principle that transformed my understanding of warfare. Position determines outcome before the battle begins. This hand-carved general became my meditation object, reminding me that superior positioning eliminates the need for direct conflict and superior force. My discovery of positioning's supreme importance came during a campaign where I faced an enemy with twice my numbers and better equipment. Every conventional approach pointed toward certain defeat. But as I studied the strategic landscape, I realized that while I couldn't match their strength, I could choose where and when that strength would be applied. Instead of meeting them where they were strongest, I positioned my forces where their advantages became irrelevant. I created a situation where their superior numbers became a logistical burden rather than an asset. Their better equipment became a disadvantage in the terrain I forced them to occupy. Most importantly, I positioned the conflict itself to be fought on terms that favored my capabilities over theirs. There are three fundamental types of strategic positions. Offensive positions allow you to advance your agenda and claim new territory while forcing others to react to your initiatives. Defensive positions protect what you've already gained while maintaining the option to counterattack when circumstances shift. Neutral positions provide flexibility to move toward either offensive or defensive stances based on how situations develop. The art lies in recognizing which position best serves your strategic objectives at any given moment. Early in my career, I believed that offensive positioning was always superior, but experience taught me that sometimes the strongest position is one that appears passive while actually controlling the flow of events. I learned to create advantageous positions in any situation by understanding that positioning isn't just about physical location. It's about controlling the dimensions that matter most for the specific challenge you face. In one memorable campaign, I gained positional advantage not by claiming better ground, but by controlling the timing of engagements, the information flow between armies, and the terms under which negotiations could occur. Personal positioning requires the same systematic thinking. Consider career advancement. Many people try to position themselves by working harder or demonstrating more competence, but strategic positioning might involve becoming indispensable for specific types of challenges, building relationships with decision-makers before you need their support, or developing expertise in areas that will become critical before others recognize their importance. The patience required for strategic positioning challenges most people's natural impulses. There's a strong temptation to take immediate action, to try to force results through direct effort. But I learned that some positions can only be achieved gradually, through sustained strategic action that might appear insignificant day by day, but creates overwhelming advantage over time. My greatest victories came from positioning that made conflict unnecessary. When your position is truly superior, enemies either avoid confronting you entirely or find themselves so disadvantaged that the outcome is predetermined. This is the supreme excellence, winning without fighting by making your position so strong that opposition becomes futile. The ancient water clock that measured my days taught me to understand time not as a linear progression of moments, but as the strategic rhythm of opportunity that governs all successful action. This timepiece became my teacher in recognizing that perfect timing often matters more than perfect planning. My understanding of strategic timing began with a humbling lesson in impatience. Early in my military career, I had developed an excellent battle plan and positioned my forces advantageously, but I acted 3 days too early. The enemy wasn't quite where my intelligence predicted, my supply lines weren't fully established, and the weather hadn't shifted to favor my tactics. The defeat that followed wasn't due to poor strategy, but poor timing. That failure taught me that there are natural rhythms governing all strategic situations, and success requires harmony with these rhythms rather than fighting against them. Just as farmers don't plant seeds in frozen ground, regardless of their eagerness for harvest, strategic minds must learn to act when conditions are ripe, rather than when they feel ready to act. I discovered 3 essential phases of strategics timing. The preparation phase is when you build capabilities, gather resources, and position elements for future action. This phase requires patience, because little visible progress occurs, yet everything depends on thorough preparation. Most people skip or rush this phase, which guarantees failure regardless of how well they execute later phases. The action phase is when all elements align to create the perfect moment for decisive movement. This phase demands speed and complete commitment because the window of opportunity often opens and closes quickly. The irony is that people who haven't prepared adequately often hesitate during action phases, while those who have prepared thoroughly can act with confidence and precision. The consolidation phase is when you secure gains from successful action and prepare for the next strategic cycle. This phase requires different skills, systematic thinking rather than bold action, careful resource management rather than aggressive advancement. Many victories are lost during consolidation because leaders fail to shift their approach from action-oriented to stability-oriented thinking. I learned to recognize when circumstances become ripe for advancement by studying the patterns that precede opportunity. Certain combinations of events, resource flows, and competitive dynamics consistently create windows for strategic action. Training myself to recognize these patterns allowed me to prepare for opportunities before they became obvious to others. The cost of acting too early versus too late became a central study for me. Acting too early wastes resources and reveals your intentions before you can capitalize on them. Acting too late means competing with others who recognize the same opportunity or operating when conditions have shifted to become less favorable. The most advanced timing skill is developing intuitive sense for the rhythm of strategic situations. This comes from combining careful analysis with experience-based pattern recognition. Over time, I developed an internal sense for when to wait, when to act, and when to accelerate. That served me better than any analytical framework. Most people either rush past the moment of opportunity through impatience or hesitate past it through over-analysis. Strategic timing requires the wisdom to prepare thoroughly, the courage to act decisively, and the discipline to consolidate systematically. The silk banner that signaled strategic withdrawal hangs in my memory as one of my most treasured possessions, representing the wisdom I gained from learning when not to fight. This tactical retreat banner taught me that withdrawal is often the highest form of strategic thinking and requires more psychological strength than advancing. My most famous strategic withdrawal occurred when facing an enemy army that outnumbered my forces 3-1 on terrain that heavily favored their tactics. Every cultural instinct demanded that I stand and fight, that I prove my courage through direct confrontation. My officers expected aggressive action, my soldiers were prepared for battle, and retreat appeared to signal weakness and defeat. But as I studied the strategic landscape, I realized that immediate battle would achieve nothing except the destruction of my army. The enemy had chosen this engagement precisely because conditions favored them so overwhelmingly. Fighting on their terms at their chosen time and their preferred location would serve their strategy, not mine. Instead of viewing retreat as defeat, I reconceptualized it as strategic repositioning. I withdrew my forces not to avoid conflict, but to change the nature of the conflict itself. By refusing to fight where they were strongest, I forced them to chase me into terrain where my advantages could be maximized and their strengths became irrelevant. The psychological strength required. For strategic withdrawal challenges everything that conventional thinking teaches about courage and leadership. There's enormous social pressure to equate retreat with cowardice, to believe that backing down represents personal failure. But I learned that the most courageous act is often refusing to fight battles you cannot win in order to position yourself for battles you cannot lose. This withdrawal led to my ultimate victory 3 months later when I had repositioned to favorable terrain, divided their forces through strategic maneuvering, and created conditions where their superior numbers became a liability rather than an asset. What appeared to be retreat was actually the opening move in a larger strategic campaign that ended in complete success. The difference between defeat and strategic positioning lies in intentionality and preparation. Defeat happens when circumstances force unwanted outcomes upon you. Strategic withdrawal happens when you consciously choose to sacrifice short-term positions to secure long-term advantages. I developed clear criteria for when withdrawal serves. Strategic purposes. When the cost of immediate victory exceeds its long-term value, when current conditions heavily favor your opponent, but future conditions will favor you, when engagement would reveal capabilities you need to keep hidden, or when apparent retreat can be used to manipulate enemy positioning. Strategic withdrawal requires turning apparent losses into future advantages through superior positioning, resource conservation, and psychological manipulation of enemy expectations. The enemy's confidence from your retreat often leads them into overextension that creates vulnerabilities you can exploit later. Modern applications of strategic withdrawal appear in many forms, declining opportunities that would overextend your resources, ending relationships that drain your energy, leaving positions that limit your growth potential, or refusing to engage in conflicts that serve others' agendas rather than your own strategic objectives. The false battle standards that once misled my enemies about my true troop positions represent one of the most delicate aspects of strategic thinking, the ethical use of deception and misdirection. These decoy banners taught me that strategic deception isn't about dishonesty for its own sake, but about protecting your true intentions while gathering the intelligence necessary for victory. My philosophy on deception developed from recognizing that transparency isn't always the best. Strategic choice, especially when dealing with opponents who would use complete honesty against you. The art lies in understanding when misdirection serves protective purposes versus when it becomes manipulative harm. I learned to appear weak when I was strong and strong when I was weak, not to deceive for deception's sake, but to control how others perceived and responded to my capabilities. When my forces were at their most powerful, appearing vulnerable often caused enemies to attack prematurely before they had adequate preparation. When my position was genuinely weak, projecting strength sometimes deterred attacks until I could improve my actual capabilities. The most sophisticated form of strategic deception involves controlling information flow rather than spreading false information. I discovered that what you choose not to reveal can be more powerful than what you actively communicate. By selectively sharing certain facts while withholding others, you can guide opponents toward conclusions that serve your strategic purposes without technically lying. During one campaign, I allowed enemy spies to discover accurate information about my troop numbers and supply levels, but I ensured they remained ignorant of my alliances and tactical innovations. Their intelligence was factually correct, but strategically incomplete. leading them to make decisions based on partial understanding that work to my advantage. The balance between authenticity and strategic privacy requires careful consideration of context and relationships. With allies and subordinates, transparency builds trust and enables coordination. With competitors and potential enemies, complete openness can be strategically naive and personally dangerous. I developed guidelines for ethical misdirection. Never deceive people who trust you with their welfare. Never use deception to harm innocents. Always ensure that your misdirection serves defensive rather than predatory purposes, and maintain enough personal integrity that you never lose sight of truth yourself. The most advanced practitioners of strategic deception understand that the goal isn't to fool others permanently, but to control the timing of when they discover your true capabilities and intentions. Sometimes revealing your strength at the right moment can be more powerful than concealing it, just as sometimes allowing others to underestimate you serves your long-term interests better than demanding immediate recognition. Modern applications include protecting your career advancement strategies until you're ready to implement them, concealing business innovations until you can secure competitive advantages, and maintaining privacy about personal goals until you've made sufficient progress to withstand skepticism or interference from others who might not support your success. The treaty scroll and personal seal that formalized my most important strategic alliances remind me that no significant victory is ever achieved in isolation. This ceremonial document represents my understanding that building coalitions for mutual benefit often determines strategic success more than individual capability or effort. My experience with strategic partnerships began with a painful lesson in attempting to achieve ambitious objectives without adequate support. Early in my career, I believed that self-reliance was the highest virtue, and that depending on others represented weakness. This philosophy led to several costly failures where I exhausted my resources trying to accomplish alone what could have been achieved easily through collaboration. The breakthrough came when I realized that strategic alliances aren't signs of personal inadequacy, but demonstrations of sophisticated thinking about resource optimization and risk distribution. The most successful campaigns in history succeeded through coordinated action between parties who understood their mutual interests and complementary capabilities. I learned to identify potential allies by analyzing whose success would be enhanced by my success, rather than threatened by it. The best strategic partnerships emerge when each party brings different strengths to common objectives, creating combined capabilities that neither could achieve independently. During one particularly challenging campaign, I faced an enemy coalition that vastly outnumbered my forces. Instead of accepting this disadvantage, I studied the political dynamics that held their coalition together and identified potential allies among neutral parties who had reasons to prevent my enemy's total success. By offering these neutrals specific benefits that aligned with their interests, I created my own coalition that shifted the strategic balance. The art of creating win-win strategic relationships requires understanding that sustainable partnerships must provide genuine value to all parties involved. Alliances based on desperation or temporary convenience typically fail when circumstances change, but partnerships built on complementary strengths and shared long-term interests often strengthen over time. I developed principles for strategics, trust that allowed me to build reliable alliances without naive vulnerability. Trust in strategic contexts isn't about blind faith in others' character, but about creating alignment of interests so strong that betrayal would harm the betrayer, more than cooperation benefits them. The most sophisticated alliance strategy involves building relationships before you need them. When you approach potential partners from a position of strength rather than desperation, you can offer better terms and attract higher quality collaborators. Emergency partnerships often require accepting unfavorable conditions, because you lack alternatives, when cooperation serves mutual benefit, and when competition serves individual goals, requires continuous assessment. Some relationships cycle between competitive and collaborative phases based on changing circumstances. The strategic mind maintains flexibility in partnerships while honoring core commitments that preserve long-term credibility. Modern strategic alliances might include professional mentorship relationships, business partnerships, social networks that provide opportunities and support, or collaborative projects that advance everyone's interests. The key is building your personal network with strategic intention rather than leaving relationship development to chance. The jade token that identified members of my intelligence network represents the supreme importance of accurate information in strategic thinking. This small carved piece taught me that wars are won and lost based on what commanders know when they know it and how they protect their own strategic information while gathering intelligence about their opponents. My education in information strategy began with a devastating defeat caused entirely by acting on incomplete intelligence. I had received reports that an enemy army was retreating in disarray, so I ordered an aggressive pursuit with the majority of my forces. What I didn't know was that their apparent retreat was actually a strategic withdrawal designed to draw my army into terrain where they had positioned a larger force for ambush. The defeat was complete and humiliating, but it taught me that in strategic thinking, accurate information is more valuable than superior numbers, better equipment, or more favorable terrain. All strategic advantages become worthless if your decisions are based on incorrect assessments of reality. I developed a systematic approach to building and maintaining intelligence networks that served me throughout my career. There are 5 types of information sources, each with different capabilities and vulnerabilities. Local sources provide detailed knowledge about specific areas, but may lack broader perspective. Internal sources offer insights into enemy decision-making processes, but face the highest risk of discovery. Converted sources bring insider knowledge, but require careful verification of their continued loyalty. Living sources can be directed to gather specific intelligence, but may be compromised over time. Expendable sources provide one-time intelligence about highly sensitive matters. The art of strategic questioning and observation became as important as managing formal intelligence networks. I learned to gather crucial information through casual conversation, careful observation of behavior patterns, and systematic analysis of publicly available information that others overlooked or misinterpreted. Protecting my own strategic information required equal sophistication. I compartmentalized sensitive knowledge so that no single person outside my inner circle understood the complete picture of my plans. I created multiple contingency plans and allowed different people to know different versions, enabling me to identify information leaks when opponents seemed to anticipate my moves. The most dangerous form of information warfare involves deliberate disinformation designed to mislead your strategic thinking. I learned to verify important intelligence through multiple independent sources, and to remain suspicious of information that seemed too convenient or that confirmed what I wanted to believe rather than challenging my assumptions. Modern information strategy requires understanding how misinformation destroys strategic thinking in both personal and professional contexts. Social media, news sources, and even well-meaning advisors often provide information that is incomplete, biased, or deliberately misleading. The strategic mind must develop systems for verifying important information and protecting sensitive plans from premature disclosure. The goal isn't to become paranoid about information, but to treat it as a strategic resource that requires the same careful management as financial resources or human capital. Good information accelerates strategic success, while bad information can destroy even the most sophisticated planning. The bronze medallion carved with lightning bolts became my reminder that speed of execution can overcome superior numbers and resources when applied at the right moment with perfect timing. This symbol taught me that strategic speed isn't about rushing, but about moving with such precision and momentum that opponents cannot adjust their plans fast enough to counter your actions. My understanding of speed as a strategic weapon emerged from a campaign where I faced an enemy alliance that was individually weaker than my forces, but collectively superior. If I allowed them time to coordinate their armies and resources, they would overwhelm me through combined strength. However, if I could defeat them individually before they could unite, their collective advantage would become irrelevant. The key insight was recognizing that there's a fundamental difference between haste and strategic speed. Haste involves moving quickly without adequate preparation, often leading to mistakes that negate any advantages gained from rapid action. Strategic speed means preparing thoroughly and then executing with such velocity that the preparation phase becomes invisible to observers. I learned to build momentum that becomes unstoppable through careful orchestration of sequential victories. Each success created resources, confidence, and positioning advantages that accelerated the next phase of action. This momentum effect meant that later victories required less effort than earlier ones because accumulated advantages compounded. Over time, the timing of strategic acceleration became crucial to master. Too early, and you waste energy moving before conditions favor rapid progress. Too late, and opportunities pass to competitors who recognize the same strategic moment. The skill lies in recognizing when all elements are positioned for explosive advancement and then committing completely to maximum speed. During my most successful rapid campaign, I achieved in 6 weeks what conventional strategy suggested would require 6 months. This wasn't because I ignored careful planning, but because I had compressed the planning phase into intensive preparation that allowed for flawless execution once action began. Every contingency was anticipated, every resource was positioned, and every decision point was predetermined. The psychological impact of strategic speed often exceeds its tactical benefits. When you move faster than opponents expect, they make decisions based on outdated assumptions about your capabilities and position. Their response cycles become disrupted, forcing them into reactive mode where they struggle to keep pace with your initiatives. But I also learned that sustainable speed requires alternating periods of intense action with periods of consolidation and preparation. Continuous high-speed operation exhausts resources and creates vulnerabilities that patient enemies can exploit. The strategic mind knows when to accelerate and when to maintain steady progress. Most people move too slowly on strategic opportunities because they want perfect information before acting or because they fear making mistakes. But I discovered that the cost of delay often exceeds the cost of imperfect action, especially when speed itself becomes a competitive advantage that closes opportunities to others while opening them for you. The smooth stones from the Yellow River that I carried with me throughout my campaigns taught me the most profound lesson about strategic adaptability. Each stone had been shaped by water's persistent flow, demonstrating how flexibility and persistence combined can overcome the hardest obstacles through patient adaptation rather than direct force. My education in the water principle began with a painful defeat caused by rigid adherence to a battle plan that circumstances had made obsolete. I had developed what I considered a brilliant strategy, but when unexpected weather changed the battlefield conditions, I stubbornly continued with the original plan rather than adapting to new realities. The enemy, less sophisticated in their planning but more flexible in their execution, adjusted their tactics to exploit the new conditions and achieved victory. That failure taught me that rigid strategies fail precisely because they cannot respond to the dynamic nature of strategic environments. No plan, however sophisticated, can anticipate every variable that will influence actual execution. The strategic mind must maintain core principles while adapting methods to changing circumstances. I learned to think like water, which always finds the path of least resistance while never abandoning its essential nature. Water doesn't fight against obstacles, it flows around them, over them, or through them, always maintaining its fundamental properties while taking whatever shape the container requires. The water principle means maintaining strategic direction while adapting tactics to current conditions. Your fundamental objectives remain constant, but your methods of achieving them must flex with changing circumstances. I discovered that leaders who could adapt their approach while preserving their core mission consistently outperformed those who had better initial plans but couldn't adjust when reality differed from expectations. During one memorable campaign, I had to completely abandon my preferred cavalry tactics because the terrain favored infantry engagement. Instead of forcing cavalry operations in unsuitable conditions, I adapted to fight the battle that the terrain demanded, rather than the battle I preferred. This adaptation led to one of my most decisive victories, because I worked with environmental conditions rather than against them. The art of strategic improvisation requires building flexibility into your fundamental strategic framework. This means developing multiple approaches to the same objective, maintaining reserves that can be deployed in unexpected ways, and cultivating the psychological flexibility to change methods without abandoning goals. Learning from unexpected outcomes became as important as celebrating anticipated successes. Every deviation from planned results provided information about environmental factors I had underestimated, resource limitations I hadn't recognized, or opponent capabilities I had misassessed. These lessons improved my strategic thinking more than victories that proceeded exactly as expected. I learned to build adaptability into my strategic framework by avoiding rigid commitments that couldn't be modified, and by maintaining options that allowed for course corrections without abandoning fundamental objectives. The goal isn't to avoid making strategic decisions, but to make decisions that preserve your ability to adapt as circumstances evolve. The most sophisticated strategic minds develop what I call tactical flexibility within strategic consistency, maintaining unwavering commitment to core objectives while remaining completely flexible about the methods used to achieve them. The mind mapping scroll that documented my observations of human behavior patterns became one of my most valuable strategic tools, representing my understanding that psychology determines strategic outcomes more than tactics, terrain, or resources. This ancient document taught me that the strategic mind must understand the psychological forces that drive human decision-making under pressure. My study of battlefield psychology began with a troubling realization. Technically superior strategies often failed not because of logical flaws, but because they didn't account for how people actually think and behave when facing stress, uncertainty, and high stakes. I discovered that human psychology follows predictable patterns that can be strategically anticipated and influenced. I learned that people make decisions based on emotions first, then use logic to justify those emotional choices. Understanding this sequence allowed me to present strategic options in ways that appealed to decision-makers' emotional priorities, while providing rational frameworks that made them comfortable with choices that served my strategic objectives, fear and confidence. Follow cyclical patterns that create strategic opportunities for those who understand these rhythms. When opponents are overconfident from recent successes, they often take risks that create vulnerabilities. When they're paralyzed by fear from recent setbacks, they miss opportunities that would restore their strategic position. By tracking these psychological cycles, I could time my initiatives to coincide with opponent vulnerability while avoiding action during their periods of peak confidence and capability. The psychology of strategic communication became essential for building support for complex initiatives. I discovered that people need to understand not just what you want them to do, but why their participation serves purposes they value. Strategic influence requires connecting your objectives to their motivations rather than simply explaining the logical merits of your approach. Reading psychological terrain in others meant understanding their core fears, primary motivations, decision-making patterns under stress, and the psychological frameworks they use to interpret information. This knowledge allowed me to predict how they would respond to different strategic pressures and to design approaches that worked with their psychology rather than against it. Maintaining psychological strength during strategic execution required developing mental disciplines that prevented external pressures from distorting my thinking. I learned techniques for remaining calm during crisis, maintaining confidence during setbacks, and preserving clarity when others around me were panicking or celebrating prematurely. The mental disciplines required for consistent strategic thinking include emotional regulation that prevents fear or excitement from corrupting judgment, cognitive discipline that maintains focus on strategic objectives despite tactical setbacks, and psychological resilience that treats failures as learning opportunities rather than identity threats. I discovered that strategic thinking itself is a form of psychological warfare, not against others, but against your own mental tendencies that work against long-term success. The strategic mind must overcome natural human biases toward short-term thinking, emotional decision-making, and reactive responses to immediate circumstances. Modern strategic psychology requires understanding how information overloads social media influence and cultural pressures affect decision-making in contemporary contexts while maintaining the timeless principles of human motivation and behavior that transcend technological change. The ceremonial commander's staff, carved with symbols representing the 5 types of leadership influence, taught me that true strategic leadership creates voluntary followership rather than forced compliance. This staff became my reminder that the highest form of leadership influence inspires others to align with your vision because they see how it serves their own deepest interests and values. My understanding of strategic influence evolved from recognizing the difference between command authority and leadership influence. Command authority relies on position, rules, and consequences to ensure compliance. Leadership influence inspires voluntary alignment based on shared purpose, mutual respect, and demonstrated competence. While command authority can force short-term behavior changes, only leadership influence creates the sustained commitment necessary for complex strategic initiatives. The first pillar of strategic leadership influence is moral authority, demonstrating through consistent action that your strategic objectives serve purposes larger than personal benefit. I learned that people will endure significant hardship and risk for causes they believe are righteous, but they resist even simple requests when they suspect self-serving manipulation. The second pillar is intellectual credibility, proving through. Results in reasoning that your strategic thinking produces better outcomes than alternative approaches. This credibility must be earned through demonstrated competence rather than asserted through position or credentials. People follow strategic leaders who consistently make decisions that improve situations rather than those who merely talk persuasively about what should be done. The third pillar is emotional connection, understanding and addressing the human needs, fears, and aspirations that motivate people's deepest commitments. Strategic leaders recognize that technical excellence means nothing if people don't feel understood, valued, and inspired by the vision being pursued. The fourth pillar is practical benefit, ensuring that following your strategic direction produces tangible improvements in people's circumstances. Even the most inspiring vision eventually requires concrete results that justify the effort and risks involved in pursuing strategic change. The fifth pillar is authentic care, genuinely investing in the success and development of those who contribute to your strategic objectives. People can sense the difference between leaders who see them as tools for achieving goals and leaders who see strategic success as a means of creating value for everyone involved. I learned to create voluntary alignment with strategic vision by connecting my objectives to followers' existing motivations rather than trying to change what they fundamentally valued. The art lies in discovering how your strategic goals can authentically serve their personal aspirations, professional development, and deeper sense of purpose. Strategic communication requires translating complex strategic thinking into clear, compelling narratives that help people understand their role in larger purposes. I developed the ability to present the same strategic initiative differently to different audiences, emphasizing aspects that resonated with their specific concerns while maintaining consistency in the underlying vision. Building influence that survives your physical presence means developing others' strategic thinking capabilities rather than creating dependency on your decision-making. The most successful strategic leaders produce more strategic leaders rather than more followers. Leading yourself strategically must precede leading others strategically. Personal strategic discipline, consistently making decisions that serve long-term objectives despite short-term temptations, provides the credibility foundation that makes strategic influence possible. The jade tablet commemorating my greatest strategic achievement, a complete victory accomplished without a single battle, represents the supreme excellence of strategic thinking, achieving your objectives by making conflict unnecessary or impossible. This precious artifact reminds me that the highest form of strategic mastery creates scenarios where everyone can win while you achieve your primary goals. My most profound strategic victory came when facing a coalition of enemy states that had united specifically to destroy my kingdom. The conventional approach would have required years of bloody warfare with uncertain outcomes and devastating costs, even in victory. Instead, I chose to pursue what seemed impossible, complete strategic success through methods that eliminated the need for military conflict. The campaign began with careful analysis of what held the enemy coalition together. I discovered that their alliance was based on mutual fear of my growing power rather than genuine shared interests. Each member had joined because they believed isolation would make them vulnerable, but their actual strategic objectives often conflicted with each other. Instead of attacking their strengths, I created conditions that made their coalition disadvantageous to maintain. Through strategic diplomacy, economic incentives, and careful information management, I offered each member alternatives that served their individual interests better than continued alliance against me. The key was ensuring that these alternatives were mutually compatible so that accepting my offers didn't require them to betray their former allies. I made conflict unnecessary by addressing the underlying concerns that had motivated their hostility. Their fear of my expansion was legitimate, so I offered binding agreements that limited my territorial ambitions in ways that protected their core interests while preserving my essential strategic objectives. Their economic concerns about trade, competition were valid, so I proposed commercial arrangements that increased prosperity for all parties. The art of strategic positioning that eliminates competition requires understanding that most conflicts arise from zero-sum thinking, the belief that one party's gain requires another's loss. By restructuring situations to create positive sum outcomes, you can often achieve your objectives while helping others achieve theirs. Creating scenarios where everyone can win demands sophisticated analysis of all parties' true interests versus their stated positions. Often what people say they want reflects underlying needs that can be met through creative solutions that weren't initially apparent to any party involved in the conflict. The long-term thinking required for conflict-free victory challenges normal strategic timelines. Solutions that eliminate conflict often take longer to implement than solutions that overcome conflict through force. However, the results tend to be more stable and sustainable because they're based on genuine alignment rather than imposed compliance. Modern applications include business strategies that create new market categories rather than competing in existing ones, career advancement approaches that add value rather than competing for limited positions, and personal relationship dynamics that solve underlying problems rather than winning arguments. The highest strategic achievement isn't defeating opponents, but making opposition unnecessary through superior value creation and genuine problem solving that serves everyone's legitimate interests. The original bamboo strips containing my strategic principles, what would become known as the art of war, represent the timeless nature of strategic thinking and its enduring power to transform lives across millennia. These ancient manuscripts remind me that true strategic wisdom creates lasting impact far beyond immediate victories. As I reflect on how these principles have guided leaders for over 2,500 years, from ancient Chinese generals to modern business executives, I'm struck by the responsibility that comes with strategic knowledge. Strategic thinking isn't just about personal advancement or competitive advantage. It's about using sophisticated understanding of human nature and systemic dynamics to create value that endures beyond your own lifetime. The transformation from reactive living to strategic mastery represents one of the most profound shifts a human mind can make. When you stop being a victim of circumstances and start becoming an architect of outcomes, you claim a form of personal power that influences every aspect of your existence. But with this power comes the obligation to use it wisely. I've shared with you the journey from that broken shield of my early defeats to the jade tablet of conflict-free victory. This progression illustrates that strategic development follows predictable stages. First, recognizing the cost of reactive thinking. Second, learning to see patterns in systems rather than isolated events. Third, developing the patience and discipline for strategic positioning. Finally, achieving the wisdom to create value for others while advancing your own legitimate objectives. Building strategic thinking into your daily life requires treating every decision as practice for developing your strategic mind. Begin each morning by identifying the 3 most important outcomes you want to influence that day. Then plan your actions to advance those outcomes while maintaining your long-term strategic direction. End each day by reflecting on what you learned about human nature, systemic dynamics, or your own patterns of thinking and behavior. The strategic principles I've shared with you aren't theoretical concepts, but practical tools that work in any era because they're based on unchanging aspects of human psychology and environmental dynamics. Whether you're navigating career advancement, building relationships, pursuing personal development, or leading organizational change, these principles provide a framework for thinking that transcends specific circumstances. Your personal call to strategic greatness begins with accepting that you have more influence over your outcomes than you've previously recognized. Most people underestimate their capacity for strategic thinking because they've never been taught to see situations systematically or to think beyond immediate reactions. I challenge you to apply these principles consistently for the next 30 days. Begin with small strategic experiments, positioning yourself advantageously in routine situations, gathering better information before making decisions, timing your initiatives for maximum impact, building alliances that serve mutual interests. Notice how strategic thinking changes not just your results, but your sense of personal agency and confidence. The strategic mind that conquers all isn't about dominating others. It's about mastering yourself sufficiently to create the outcomes you want while contributing value to the world around you. This is your invitation to join the ranks of strategic thinkers who shape circumstances rather than merely responding to them. Your strategic legacy begins today.